So, as per your worksheets, number 4, the Gospel of John. Even fewer passages we're going to look at here. The Gospel of John, chapter 20, verses 30 to 31, and the Gospel of John, chapter 21, verses 24 to 25, in order to discuss this issue of what theologians, Christian theologians, refer to as Christology. That is the logical rational principle of the Christ. What does it mean to say Jesus Christ? Jesus Christ. Jesus the Christ. This gospel, the Gospel of John, I said the last book of the New Testament to be written, notwithstanding technically the book of the Apocalypse, Revelation, which, as I also mentioned, a lot of biblical scholars tend to think of as a second half, really, of the Gospel of John. In any event, written around the year 100, somewhere between 100 and 110, by this guy named John, who was one of the 12. So the Apostle John, as well as the author of the Gospel of that name, although recently some biblical scholars question that, but we'll take the approach that it was, in fact, authored by this John. Okay. When analyzing the figure of Jesus, there is a distinction that we first must make. It's one thing to talk about Jesus of Nazareth, that is, the historicity of this particular human person. For that matter, did the human person really exist? Made up? In any event, either way, the historicity, the historical figure, Jesus of Nazareth. It's another thing to talk about Jesus Christ, or Jesus the Christ. And with that comes yet a further distinction we need to make. When we say Jesus Christ, by Christ, do we mean that he's the Son of God, which means fully divine? Fully divine. Or do we mean something more of a miracle worker? Maybe even kind of a superhero? A demigod. A demigod. Maybe there's a spark of the divine, but not fully divine, not God. Okay. With that, indulge me as I proclaim these very short passages to you. So, chapter 20, verses 30 to 31 first. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. Second passage, chapter 21, verses 24 to 25. This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true. But there are also many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were to be written down, I suppose that the whole world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Are these two passages talking about the same Jesus? Is it a different Jesus? First of all, if you look in the English and translation and the Greek original, you'll notice I have highlighted in yellow Jesus the Messiah, Son of God, and in the Greek text obviously as well. and I've crossed out the word Messiah. Why? Because for yourselves, you can see it looking down at the Greek text. That's not what is written. The Greek word for the Hebrew Mashiach is Messias or Messiah. That's not what the original Greek text says. The Greek text uses the term Christos, which we've already learned means in English Christ. So cross out Messiah and write Christ, because that's what's actually said. We don't have time to get into what is the Messiah, the ancient Hebrew understanding of the Messiah, but it's not the same. Okay, so that's the first thing. All right, so back to, this is the same Jesus that's being portrayed here for us? If I were to ask you that one of these ideas of Jesus Christ, fully divine or demigod, goes with one of these respective passages, which one would you put with which? Well, it would seem to be pretty obvious. The first passage, chapter 20, verses 30 to 31, says Jesus is the Christ. Moreover, what kind of a Christ? The Son of God. In other words, this passage portrays Jesus Christ as being fully divine. The other passage, Jesus did some crazy stuff, raised the dead, walked on water, faster than a speeding bullet. But he's not God. Sounds more like Superman, maybe even Hercules, but not God. Indeed, this passage, theologians, biblical scholars interpret as precisely that. It's certainly not making the claim that, indeed, Jesus is not only Christ, but what kind of a Christ? Fully divine, Son of God. Okay, now, here's the kicker. These are two different versions to the ending of the Gospel of John. Kind of like, I don't know, old Choose Your Own Adventure books, or, some movies at the end, they have like 3 or 4 different ways the movie could have ended. Okay. Which one of these would you guess is the original, the first version? The fully divine version or the demigod version? Surprise, surprise. Most biblical scholars and theologians concur that the original ending, even though it comes chronologically later in this gospel, the original ending is that second passage, which portrays Jesus as at best a demigod. The previous passage chronologically is a later addition and addition. How much later? We can't say. We said the gospel was written somewhere between 100 and 110. So I don't know, maybe the year 111, certainly by the year 200. But that's a pretty wide gap, if you think about it. Okay. That leads us then to our third and final passage that we are going to look at here, namely the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, verses 13 through 20, which was written by another one of the 12, a guy named Matthew, the author of this particular gospel. Somewhere in between that first passage we looked at, the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, and now the Gospel of John. So maybe the year 70, 75, somewhere around there. And this passage focuses on what is within ecclesiology and Christology, even more specifically referred to as Petrology, as in Peter, to which we now turn. What is the logical or rational principle of this Peter? Okay. One more time, I will do my best to worthily proclaim this for you. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Shimon bar Yona, Simon son of Jonah, or Simon son of John. For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Okay. First of all, the reason why I made those frowny faces, Messiah, once again, you see it highlighted in yellow, crossed out. Messiah. It's not what's in the original Greek. Just look at the passage below. It's highlighted for you there as well, but you can verify it. Trust but verify. You see the word Christos, so it's Christ. So make sure you cross out Messiah and write Christ. Okay. This, again, is a piece of literature, kind of like the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, is maybe even a little more awkward, or at least not really clear to the ear. Especially verse 17 and 18. Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church. Oh, he's reminding the guy, like, did this Simon, son of John, or Simon Peter suddenly forget? Oh yeah, I'm Peter. Thanks for reminding me. Once again, lost in translation. So, to begin with, if you go down to the Greek text, you'll see highlighted in, I guess that's teal, that kind of turquoise color, teal, right? You see two words in Greek that look very similar. Petros, Petra. Petros, Petra. These two words correspond, you see, in the English text, highlighted also in teal, but crossed out in the case of the first one where it says Peter. The second one says rock. In the first century, if you were walking around anywhere in the Roman Empire, you would never have met a Peter. Maybe a Dick, but not a Peter. The name did not exist. It's not a name. It is now, centuries later, because of the famous guy that has not this name, but this title. And the word in Greek, Petros or Petra, means rock. Don't be confused by the changes in the endings on the word. That's only because Greek, unlike English, but Greek, like Latin, like German, Russian, is a declined language. So depending on where the word is used, how it's used in the sentence, the ending changes. But it's the same word, rock. Okay. So you cross out on the English text where it says Peter and just write rock. Also in green, you see highlighted in the English text church, but verify for yourselves. Look down at the Greek text and you'll see highlighted in green. Remember that term I mentioned earlier, ecclesian, in this case, the ending, but ecclesia. So not church, political assembly. Political assembly. Make sure you write that in the English text. So now that we have the proper translation, let's try it again in English. And I tell you, verse 18, I tell you, you are rock. And on this rock, I will build my political assembly. Well, that sounds a lot clearer now. Not necessarily understandable, because so, a rock, whatever, to which we're now turning. as we look at the next verse, verse 19. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. In the ancient world, wherever you are, whenever a king left the palace or the kingdom, they left one guy in charge in the place of the king until the king returned. And until the king returned, that individual's words and decisions were binding on the entire kingdom until the king returned. The ancient Persians called this the vizier, for which we not coincidentally get the word in English, wizard. What does a wizard look like? How can you tell if you're at a Halloween party? How do you tell, like, I don't know, Gandalf from, I was going to say Harry Potter, but Gandalf from, I don't know, a bumblebee? Right? What's the costume? What is Gandalf wearing? A funny hat? A big robe? Most importantly, holding a very large staff. A large staff. The ancient Persians, again, called this the vizier. In ancient Rome and Latin, they called it, sounds similar, that's not a mistake, vicarius, vicar. In any event, the one that stands in the place of, and in this case, in the place of the king until the king returns. And at the beginning, literally, physically, the king would give this individual not the keys to the place, but because in the ancient world, you just had a key. And they were really long, really big. The teeth of the key were about as big as a human head because the keyholes, the locks, were really big. It was so large that this individual would have to walk around with it. Hence where a wizard gets his staff from. Or later, a king in, let's say, medieval Europe will get the scepter from. The royal scepter is actually a vestige of the ancient key that a king would give to the one designated to stand in the place of the king until the king returned. I said, the ancient Persians called this the vizier, the ancient Romans called it the vicar, the vicarius. What does Jesus call it? Which presumes Jesus is a king. We're coming to that. Jesus calls it rock. In fact, I will give you the keys of the kingdom. Jesus is a king. Where is Jesus' kingdom? Of heaven. A divine king. In any event, still a king. Consequently, needs someone in his place. Doesn't call it a wizard or a vizier or a vicar, calls it rock. Rock. Petros in Greek, Petrus in Latin, Peter in English, but it means rock. And it's not primarily a name. It's this title of this office of the one that stands in the place of the king. And consequently, it's no mistake if we go back to the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians we looked at, chapter 15, the first one that the newly raised from the dead Jesus Christ appears to is the kephas, the head, because the head is one and the same with or as the one that stands in the place of the king, because this individual stands in the place of the king. So while the king is away, who's in charge? Who's the head? Rock. I hope that's clear enough for you here. With that said then, this sums up what we wanted to cover, particularly in these three passages, the history behind it briefly, obviously, some of the theology behind it, because each of these three things, ecclesiology, Christology, Petrology, are very important, especially in the context of Christianity, the Roman Catholic Church, New Testament, especially here in the eternal city of Rome. So with that, almost forgot. This is the better way to conclude, perhaps. Why? What was the reason behind, why did Jesus pick this guy? One of the 12, Shimon Bar Yona, Simon son of Jonah, or Simon son of John. The name is interchangeable, Jonah, John. Why did he choose this one of the 12 for the role? Why didn't he choose John? Why didn't he choose James? Why this guy? As usual, the answer is in the question. In this case, the question in the text. What is Jesus' question? Who do you say that I am? Only one guy responds. That guy is Simon, son of John. What is his response? You are the Christ. What kind of a Christ, moreover? So not even waffling. You are the Christ, comma, the Son of the living God. Consequently, apparently you're the only one that figured it out, so I guess I should choose you to be the one that's going to stand in my place, that I'll call rock. Therefore you are rock, and on this rock I will build my political assembly. What kind of political assembly? A kingdom of monarchy, so I got to have somebody to stand in my place. You'll be the head until I get back. Try not to break anything. In the meantime, okay. With that, then, I look forward to our next lecture session. Stay safe and healthy, and see you next time.